Thank all of you. So your work is really important. I have a PowerPoint, and as my friend Manuel says, you know, the only need two things if you have a PowerPoint, and that's power and a point. So I at least have one of them. I'll let you decide which. And I may not get through all the slides. I know we're a little compressed for time, and we had this wonderful presentation by Isabel, and all of you ran out to get your book signed. I have a book out there too. So we won't go there.
John, I just want people to know at the end of the day, John, you're signing your book outside.
Okay. Manuel has a book too. You know, we can do this all day. So I'm going to actually talk to you about a number of things. And as we were preparing, I kept getting emails saying, and can you talk about this too? And can you talk about this too? But you got less time. So I touched on some things. I may not have time to fully develop them. Hopefully in the dialogue we can go more deeply. So part of this is sort of understanding not just race and the racial wealth gap, but really understanding race, period. Now here are, and I'm sure you can't read this, it's a busy slide, but I'll give it to you. Basically, there are different ways of thinking about wealth. And people around the country, around the world, are developing different concepts about wealth. You can think about wealth as basically what you need to have well-being. And it could be money, it could be something else. But our particular way of thinking about it in the United States is fairly narrow. And the UN is having some alternative ones. There's an inclusive wealth index. One way of thinking about wealth that I use sometimes is belonging. That when you belong to a society, and this is Emeritus Sen's work in Development as Freedom, when he argues that starvation is almost never a shortage of food, it's a shortage of political participation and belonging. The most important thing a society gives or withholds to its folks is membership. And if you don't belong, then nothing else really matters. So I'll come back to that a little later. And it's also important to think about wealth, not just in terms of your individual wealth, but your community. We all are part of the community. I'm actually going through some, I don't know, mild anxiety. I've known Roger for 47 years, but that's not the reason I'm anxious, although that would be a good reason. A number of my friends and I was saying this to Manuel, are getting ready to retire. And Alan Hausman, I don't know how many know Alan Hausman from class. I just got an email from him saying he's stepping down after 32 years. The reason that's important is that the network that I've worked with for years is becoming thinner. Now there's new people who are younger, but in terms of wealth, in terms of capacity, in terms of leverage, who you know matter. And so when you think about wealth, it's not just your wealth, it's the network you're in. Does your community have wealth? So we know that the wealth gap, and we already talked about this, is deeply racialized. And this is just basically showing high poverty and low poverty neighborhoods. So whites, for example, by and large don't live in high poverty neighborhoods. On the other hand, blacks and Latinos are very much likely to live in high poverty neighborhoods. And that's even if you're middle class. So blacks and Latinos are much more likely to have neighbors who are struggling even if they are not struggling. And that matters. So when you look at, for example, the decline in wealth in this Great Recession, if you live in a high poverty neighborhood, you lost 91% of your wealth. 91% of your wealth. So that explains in part how blacks went from 10 to 1 in terms of the wealth gap to 19 to 1. And again, it's not just individual blacks, it's the entire community. And I think Latinos are somewhere just under that, like 18 to 1, not doing much better. So despite all the work that you're doing and the work that Roger's doing and Insight is doing, the wealth gap has exploded. And the thing that's interesting, if you think about this, it's exploded on President Obama's watch. So there's some dynamics that are going on structurally that's actually perpetuating and accelerating the wealth gap. What's also particularly interesting is that with some noted exceptions, there's virtually no comment on this in the major media. And even more disturbing, there's no policy intervention. It's not like, okay, so what do we do about this? obviously, if we don't know what this is, we can't figure out what to do about it. So there's some big problems that we have to address, and the problems are getting bigger. And I met with some of the folks from NAACP this morning, and I would suggest that unless we have some serious intervention, this problem will persist. And the persistence of it is actually worse than what I just said. So we talked about the wealth gap, but think about this. The wealth gap has increased while whites' wealth has decreased. Right? So and go back to that slide I showed you a couple of slides ago, and you see that whites actually are losing wealth as well, but we're just losing wealth at a much faster rate. So it's really kind of a bleak picture. This is actually an interesting slide because it shows what the actual wealth distribution is and what people think it is and what people feel like is ideal wealth distribution in the country. The last one is what people think should be the ideal wealth distribution in the country. And you can see where we actually are is that the top 20% basically own all the wealth in the country. And what people think is ideal is that the top 20% own about 32% of the wealth in the country. So it suggests at least that people have an appetite for something different. It's not clear how they would get there, but most Americans believe that this extreme inequality, and I don't know if that's because they read Manuel's book, because he makes this point, is actually problematic.
I think that's the reason, yeah.
I think that is the reason. And so it gives us an opening to begin to talk about this in some very interesting ways. So how do we talk about it? So this is one of the ways I talk about it. Now, we've been talking about the binary between blacks and white. There's a lot of interesting ways to actually, as we would say, complicate or problematize that. And I will do two things to do that right now. First of all, I think the binary is a problem. We need to move beyond it. But I want to suggest that we have more than a binary. We have actually a gradient. And the gradient is probably more accurate than the binary. But I want to even go further and suggest that the gradient is not just about race, which of course all of you will know, but it's actually three-tiered. At the top tier are the elites. And the elites early on in the 17th century did not have a race. When race was sort of taking hold in the new colonies, the middle stratum, not the top stratum, the middle stratum was white. The bottom stratum was everybody else, every other race. And the elites were not raced at all. The elites were actually corporate. Virginia, one of these important blue states in the last election, Virginia was the most important colony. Virginia was a corporation. And as the racial dynamics were unfolding in the colony, you always had this three-tier system with the elites, the middle stratum, and then non-whites. And the middle stratum had a dual role. It was to have allegiance to the elites and patrol the non-whites. And that function was important in terms of membership and in terms of the definition of whiteness itself. And so part of the ways in which we try to make sense of why, certainly in the South, and many whites have this sort of allegiance to the moneyed people, it actually goes back to the 17th century. But it's even worse than that, because we talk about public and private. And I've written about this and would be happy to share with any of you who are interested. Public and private is the way we talk about, it's a frame, it's a meta-narrative, if you will, and with the idea that the public is bad and the private is good. It's actually a brilliant frame, and it actually creates a huge blind spot. What do I mean by that? Well, I don't have time in the short time I have this morning to fully flesh that out for you, but private is actually a sacred concept in the United States and in the West. Private actually took hold in the Reformation, and Luther actually gave full flush to the idea of private. Private was where you retreated to actually commune with God. And so it really was an incredibly sacred space. Now, we don't hang out with God like we used to maybe 100 and 200 years ago, but we still have the trappings of something sacred about private. And so when we talk about public being bad and private being this really special place, the quote-unquote founding fathers had a very similar concept, and private was individuals and small artisans. It was not, and I emphasize, it was not corporations. They did not trust corporations. They were concerned with concentrations of power, both public and private power. And corporations, as you know earlier on, was really an extension of the government. They didn't have, in that sense, they were quasi-public rather than quasi-private. They were chartered to do very specific things. At the end of that charter, they would go out of existence, and the charter was, so they literally came into existence for the public good. So when we talk about public being bad and private being good, what corporations have been able to do is to smuggle themselves into that private space, into that sacred space that should be left alone. So what I'm suggesting here is actually, they're not two spheres, they're four. There's public, which we sort of have a sense of, collective action government. There's private, which is, again, individuals and small artisans. There's non-public and non-private, which is probably the least intuitive, and there's corporate. And these domains are interactive, and if one gets out of alignment, it affects the other. So let me just say a little bit about non-public, non-private. Non-public, non-private is where you don't have an effective public voice, and you don't have a private place to retreat to. Well, who is that? Well, Isabel already told us. In the caste system, blacks, my parents were sharecroppers, they didn't have any place to retreat to. They were literally living on somebody else's land. They couldn't vote. They didn't have a public voice, and didn't have private space. Slaves, no public voice, no private place to retreat to. Undocumented immigrants, no public voice, no private place. Homeless, and you just keep, so the most vulnerable in society hang out in the non-public, non-private space. And then the fourth space, of course, is corporate. And as we expand the corporate, it actually misaligns these other domains. It actually diminishes public. We can't support public institutions in an effective way. But the kick is it also diminishes private. So even though it calls itself private, as we misalign corporate space, it actually undermines private. And I know a number of you have your iPhones and your BlackBerries and when you make your keystrokes, somebody's watching. You don't have privacy in the way that you think. And so this is not, and I've written about this and I'm doing work on this, this is not a broad attack on corporations, but it's basically saying corporations are misaligned. And we can't really get an effective democracy until we realign corporations. Now you might say, well, that's interesting, but how do we actually think about that in terms of race? And this is actually what's surprising. How many of you have heard of the case of Dred Scott? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you realize that was a corporate case? Okay. All right. Other than Barbara. And Sandy. All right. There's always a couple in the crowd, right? But again, I've sort of talked about this. It's still true today, very quickly. Corporations didn't want to be controlled by states because because states do mischief and they wanted to have freedom to sort of move around. Think about the Republican Party. And so they wanted corporations to be able to go into federal court under the auspices of diversity citizenship. When citizens of different states have a contest and they go into courts, they can go into federal court. Well, this is the 1840s, 1850s. Corporations started asserting that they were citizens for the purpose of diversity jurisdiction. The South was going crazy. It was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. First of all, they didn't like corporations, period. But secondly, they were concerned that if you would grant citizenship to corporations, don't you then have to grant them to free and enslaved blacks? And that would destroy slavery. And so Justice Taney came up with this ingenious strategy. What if we create a super subordinate category for blacks, free or slaves, that they were not citizens, could never be citizens, would never intend to be citizens, and then you would create space that was okay, it was safe to extend citizenship to corporations. Now, that relationship is a profound relationship that has existed and continues to exist today. and yet we almost never talk about it or study it. That is, as you expand corporations, you contract civil rights, and you expand the non-public, non-private space. So it's very much racialized. But we don't study that in school, and we think of corporations and economy over here, and race is something that's totally different. So part of that comes, and this is a book, if you like this stuff, it's called The Illusion of a Free Market. The idea of you don't regulate the market, although you always have a regulated market, it's regulated to what ends, and you regulate people. There's a very strong relationship between the penal system, for example, and neoliberalism. Again, we almost never make those connections. So I'm going to talk a little bit about whiteness. This is actually one of the moves I make in my book, and that whiteness, first of all, race is a verb. Race is a set of practices that create social location and meaning. It's not a thing. It's not dark skin. It's not light skin. It's a set of social practices. And so we have to look at what are the practices that create race, and what work is race doing. And again, can't go into this very deeply, but I would suggest when you think about American exceptionalism and the whiteness that came out of American exceptionalism is born of two parents. One parent is slavery, and the other parent is enlightenment. Those two things together created whites in America, created white identity and this middle stratum. The Enlightenment and slavery. And race, like most things, was defined largely in terms of what it was not. Whiteness was defined in terms of what it was not. So one reason whiteness became so fearful of dependency that if you're dependent, you slip into slavery, you slip into being black. So white was anti-black. And it was based with this sort of insecurity because slaves was in the myth. It wasn't an abstraction, it was real. So if you read David Roediger's book, Wages of Whiteness, at the end of the Civil War, this is incredible fear that whites being forced to work in factories makes them similar to slaves. They call it slave labor. So you have this real anxiety around whiteness. And again, as part of the Enlightenment Project, the way you deal with this is you have complete control, you have domination, you have fear, you have this extreme individualism that's always written against the racial other. And so, in a sense, fear has been embedded in the very being of whiteness. Now, what I'm suggesting in terms of this, in terms of understanding where we are today, we have to understand that this is a deep ontological space that conservative whites are in, and it's incredibly anxious and fear-based. It's not, so literally, this is a spiritualized space. It's a space about being. And basically we say to them is, look, give up your being and we're going to give you some stuff. Right? And then we get confused. We say, why are they voting against their interests? Really what they're saying, if we go more deeply, is they're trying to hold on to their being, and they're saying the economic interest in the narrow sense is not as important as their ontological grounding. We have not engaged them at the point of their ontological grounding. And they're basically trying to figure out what does it mean to be white in America given the changing demographics. And we haven't really answered that question. We need to engage that question at a much more serious level. So this is from Richard Healy. In a way, the meta-narrative. And we need, someone said yesterday, we need to come up with our own meta-narrative. So what's the meta-narrative that the right wing has been able to use? It's been individualism, which is this sort of radical, rugged individual that's not connected to anything. That's the ideal. Anti-government and no taxes, and pro-market. Now, think about this. We're talking about going over a fiscal cliff, whatever that is. And what President Obama is saying, I want to tax people who are making more than $200,000 or families making more than $250,000. That's only about 3% of Americans fit in that category. So he's basically saying, I'm not going to tax you. I'm going to tax those folks. And people are saying, no, you can't do it. You know, we would die. Why are they willing to? Why are poor people, and particularly poor whites in the South, willing to fall on the sword for rich people? the thing that holds us together is race. Because implicit in this is that we're taking stuff from good, hard-working elites and giving it to undeserving blacks. That's the subtext. It's the resentment of blacks that's holding us together. So this master narrative that the right wing has had, even without saying race, race is always at the core. So whether we're talking about food stamp, whether we're talking about people who want stuff, whether we're talking about people who are free riders, whether we're talking about 47%, it's always about race. And it's basically saying to whites who are fearful about their identity that we have to keep those people in their place. You know, no honking, no passing. Okay, you can pass now, but no honking. So we haven't engaged this. So race is central to understanding both the master narrative and what holds. So Lindsey Graham says the problem that Republicans are facing right now is they can't produce enough angry white men, right? So their strategy was we need foot soldiers. The elites have never had the numbers. They need foot soldiers. So how do they get foot soldiers? They do it through exacerbating racial anxiety. Now, Sandy asked the question, I think someone, about is that strategic? Is it endemic to the stuff we talk about, the mind science? It's a little of both. But in some ways, the very concept of whiteness has built into it this deep anxiety. And for much of our history, it seemed to work. That is, we're able to give these anxious whites something, including stuff, but more importantly, membership. They were able to belong. This was their country in some imaginary way, in the ways that it was not the Latinos countries, in the ways that it was not Native Americans countries, in the way it was not black country. That's going away. It's no longer their country. Of course, it's our country, all of ours. But that's not satisfactory because that puts whites in relationship to the other. And just think about this. Think about the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule, which I think all of you know, is that one drop of black blood destroys whiteness, which means white is very fragile, right? And blackness is very powerful. But based in that is this deep, deep fear. So that's what we're dealing with now as we sort of move forward. And I want to show you a slide, and while he's pulling that up, it's not simply we're activating the fear that's already there. We're activating anxiety that's already there. But people have the capacity to move beyond that or to be totally engulfed in it. You have sound on this? I mean, we have sound, of course. Unless you speak Mandarin, it probably doesn't matter all that much.
为什么强大的国家都会走向灭亡呢？古希腊、罗马帝、不列颠帝国、美国，因为他们都犯同样的错误，与原来使得他们成功的原则背道而驰。美国政府企图以庞大的开支和税收来摆脱严重的经济衰退，巨额的所谓刺激开支。 庞大的医疗改革，政府接管私有企业，债务累累。当然，我们是他们的大债主。现在他们都得给我们干活。
You can change the future. You have to. Join Citizens Against Government Waste to stop the spending that is bankrupting America.
So some of you, many of you I'm sure have seen this before. This ad was made about 2 years ago, but it ran in the recent election cycle. And it's not really against health care or even a stimulus. It's actually stoking deep racial anxiety. And when you read, when you sort of look at this article, look at this piece, and then read articles, you see this incredible thing going on. This was in the paper a couple of days ago, that China has overtaken the United States as the global trading partner. And you read the article, and it's actually almost funny. It's almost a parody, because it says, you know, by many accounts, China feels like it's returning to its rightful place. But it says now there are different ways of measuring trading, and the good news is, at least some of those measures, the United States continues to lead until the end of 2013. And literally by the end of 2013, the projection is China will overtake the United States in almost every way we measure global trading. And then they interview a guy who has a factory, and he says, I'm not building any more factories in the United States. He says the United States is a has what? And I'm going to China. My kids are going to learn Mandarin. And I have a granddaughter who's 3 years old. She's going to learn Mandarin too. But the point is that it's actually stoking on this deep anxiety. And the New York Times about a month ago ran a piece that says, we're entering into a period for the first time in 300 years when the world will not be led or dominated by a white Christian country. I mean, they just put it out there. I mean, you can, when you sort of, so it's like, is that just a factual claim, or is that something we should be anxious about? Now, when we read that, many of us is like, yay! But when they read it, it's like, man, where do we go? You know, the data is, so we talk about data and destiny and the demographic change that's happening in the United States. It's happening in the world. It's a little bit more complicated because we're not sure the racial categories will hold and do the work that they've done in the past. We sort of ignore that piece, and that piece is important, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. But there's a suggestion that by the end of this century, no major city in the world will be majority white. So if your identity is based on domination, control, separation, what do you do with that? It's like, man, this is... So there's this guy, this billionaire, who said he wants to colonize Mars by the end of the century. Now, I don't know if there's any relationship or not, but there might be. So think about this. Think about the Southern strategy. First of all, how did the South become the backbone of the Republican Party? And I won't torture you with this. All of you know the Southern strategy, and Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Bill and saying, I'm giving the South to the Republicans for two generations. Before that, if you were a Republican, you could virtually not win an election in the South because of the war of aggression, which some of us call the Civil War, they call it the war of aggression. And so the strategy was, how do you activate white racial resentment, particularly against blacks, a strategic racial move by the elites to give them space to then have anti-government, no regulations, corporate misalignment, and it worked until recently. And then this is the situation that the country's in now. And the Republicans are thinking out loud. They're saying, we still won the South. You know, even if we had won Florida and Virginia, Obama would have won because of the changing demographics. That the Southern strategy still works on some level in terms of producing the South, but doesn't work in terms of producing a national election. What are we supposed to do? So this is what they're thinking about. And this is just some data. If you look at both the data and what Republicans are saying, the whole conversation is, how do we expand our base to reach Latinos? Maybe they'll even say gays. And there's some of these things, and I know you can't read them all, is we want hardworking minorities that share our values. Who are those minorities? In their mind, they're Latinos and they're Asians, Asian Americans and Latinos, right? Who's missing in this formulation are blacks. Again, there's a thread of anti-black resentment and racism that's running through their public discourse right now. Now, why would they be so hostile to blacks? Roger doesn't remember this, but we went to school with Mitt Romney. And his father was a decent person. His cousin was a decent person. It's just that he wasn't. But my real point is that I don't think Romney is an old-style racist. He's strategically using race. And this is the dilemma of the Republican Party, and it's our dilemma as well. Their strategy is, how do we hold on to that southern base? Because if we let that southern base go, we have to start from scratch. Instead, what we want to do is extend the southern base. How do we extend it? In order to hold on to it, they have to hold on, at least at this point, into black resentment. And so it's like, can we hold on to racial resentment and peel off enough Latinos, enough gays? But the thing that keeps Southern whites in play for the Republican Party and voting for the money and the elites is hostility toward blacks. And so that's the discussion that's being had. And the Democrats haven't been so good either. When the Democrats were labeled as the Civil Rights Party and the Party of Blacks in the 1980s, they started running from it. They said, okay, we're not. You know, it's like, oh, there's some black person behind you. I don't know that guy. And so you have Bill Clinton and others sort of sending out dog whistle racism. And I think all of you know what dog whistle racism is. It's a dog whistle is when you blow a whistle. A dog can hear it, but the rest of us can't. And so the idea is, can we send racialized messages to our white racial base that has this racial anxiety that doesn't scare off white moderates? And that's been the strategy. So where the unconscious stuff becomes important. Now it's interesting, I said, you know, when Romney started talking about the 47%, he picked up the wrong whistle. He thought it was a dog whistle. It was just a regular whistle. And everybody... and everybody heard him. It's like, oh, my God. So in a sense, though, it suggests what we need to do as well. We need to think about how do you actually build both a more enduring alliance and coalition, and also space for these ancient whites to actually come into. Now, some people disagree with that. It's like, why are we reaching out to these ancient whites if these anxiety-ridden whites in the South who's been always against us? And in some of the work I've done, I've talked a lot about the othering process. We actually create a sense of self often by how we treat the other. And when we have a hard edge against the other, it creates an anxiousness within the self. Again, Isabel talked about this a little bit when she talked about if you have someone in the ditch, then that's your job too. You're right there. You got to stay at the ditch because if you leave, they're going to leave. And so this is actually a little bit counterintuitive as well, that this is a profoundly spiritual project, but the goal is not to just even just beat Southern whites. It's actually to maybe end this war of aggression for real and become the aspiration of the United States that's inclusive, where we don't spend time creating this extreme other, which also then distorts the self. So how do we start to do that? We need to develop a different strategy. We need to develop different language. And part of this is actually happening at the unconscious level. And you heard Alexis yesterday talk about the unconscious. The unconscious, and I was saying this to Roger, the unconscious is incredibly complicated. I'll give you a couple of numbers and see if you can tell me what they are. And if you can tell me the numbers, you get a free prize. The first number is 10 to the 80th power. That means 10 with 80 zeros after it. And the second number is 10 to the millionth power. That's 10 with a million zeros after it. So anyone, what do those numbers represent?
Muslim and Catholic.
What?
Muslim and Catholic.
Not quite. Okay, there's no reason you should know this. Yes?
Is it the amount of money that a white person would have to make to agree to be black?
Oh. I hadn't thought of that. Well, that too, but But no, the number that's been used is 10 to the 80th power is the number of atoms in the universe. 10 to the 80th power, the number of atoms in the universe. So what's 10 to the millionth power? 10 to the millionth power is the number of computations the brain is capable of making. So think of that. I mean, number of atoms in the universe, and then think of the brain. It's just like exploding. The brain is so phenomenal. Some of the scientists, neuroscientists, are saying we should stop talking about the conscious self because the conscious self is a fraud. Everything is happening at the unconscious level. We need to learn how to talk to the unconscious, how to relate to the unconscious. And the unconscious is multiple. And this is the real kicker. When we talk about individuality, if the individual were to exist, it would exist at the conscious level. The unconscious is social. The unconscious is constantly interacting with the environment. So the reason that African Americans will have anxiety about African Americans in the United States, not in Africa, is because of stuff they're getting from the environment. It's environmental. And so these are big issues, and we need to deal with them in a whole different way. And at the extreme, as I already mentioned, when we have someone that's other, we not only don't like them, at the unconscious level, they cease to be human. There's part of the brain that lights up when we see another human being. When people are extremely othered, we don't see them at an unconscious level as human. And if we don't see someone as human, we will not adopt effective policy for them. So if you're trying to address the racial wealth gap, it's like, what's the wealth gap between, let's say, humans and gorillas? It's like, who cares? Right? That's the next project for Insight. So we have to actually make sure that the targeted group is human. And what I'm suggesting to you that a lot of groups, and particularly African Americans and to some extent Latinos, don't show up in the national mind as human at unconscious level. And so we have to do the work of pulling them back into what I call the circle of humanity. Robert Putnam talks about building bridges across these social cleavages, and I think that's a prophylactic measure. Really what we want to do is remove the cleavages altogether. We need to think about our othering process, the work it's doing, and it's doing not only work that hurts the other, it's hurting the self, it's hurting all of us, it's hurting the country, and it's hurting the world. So that's our vision. We're not just concerned about diversity, we're concerned about equity, inclusion, and addressing these cleavages. In order to do this, you need power, you need to address and understand the unconscious, and you need to focus on structures and institutions and the work they're doing. And that's what we're doing at the Haas Institute. We're at the beginning of that and trying to build this network of scholars, activists, to actually do this, really to save not just the people who are marginalized, but really the country. And we talk about that in part under the concept of targeted universalism. And I have a couple of minutes left, and let me just say, and I've said this to Roger many times, we really want to get away from a limited disparity focus. So we say we want to eliminate the racial wealth gap. I say that's not what we want to do. Because we can eliminate the racial wealth gap by just taking everybody's wealth. Right? Nobody has any wealth. Now there's no more disparity. And we got close to that during the Depression. The gap between whites and blacks in the Depression actually declined. But it's not because blacks were doing better, it's because whites were doing worse. So we really want to say, what is our goal? We need universal goals and targeted strategies based on how people are situated within structures. And we're all situated within structures. And we should state what those universal goals are. What we oftentimes do is to adopt universal strategies. And universal strategies simply don't work. Roger and I have written something, I think he's going to talk to you about that sometime tomorrow, about calling for this, about saying what is our goal as a nation, as a people, that everybody wants. And then to get there, so if we think of home ownership, Tom talked about, Native Americans have a home ownership rate of about 26%. So if we say we wanted, and I don't know if we do want this, but let's say we wanted everybody to have, every community to have home ownership at around 76 or 70 or 80%. For whites, that would be a small move. For Native Americans, it would be a huge move. And I can tell you you've actually done this work in Portland with the Native American community, Latino community, and black community, and the white community, and it worked. Because first of all, when the Native Americans and Latinos kept talking about disparities, the whites weren't feeling it because they were just showed up as just a normalizing. We weren't acknowledging anything for them. And in fact, there was a fear that they was going to have to give something up in order to get to that goal. So again, I want to push the notion that you at least think about moving to universal strategies, universal goals, targeted strategies. And it's recognizing that structures matter. The structures actually affect people in a differential way. So if we're trying to get everyone to the third floor, that's our goal. Our strategy is the escalator. If you're in a wheelchair, it doesn't work. It's not that the person in the wheelchair wants some special dispensation. Everybody else is getting on the escalator. Why don't you? And we can try to fix that by fixing the person, right? It's like we can give the person a couple of canes and some braces and say, good luck. But the problem is structural. We need to fix the structures so the structures are sensitive to people in their different situatedness. And all of us are situated somewhere within those structures, and it's not the same. So develop and understand our situatedness, which actually gives us a way of talking about race. Talking about, when people say, what about the poor people in Appalachia? And I say, yeah, we should be caring about the poor people in Appalachia. Usually when people say that, though, they're not serious about the poor people in Appalachia. They just want to give anything to black people. And it's like you can't get anything to there, not any more poor people in Appalachia. It's like, well, that I'm not down for. But I don't mind trying to extend our efforts to other groups who are also situated in a way where they're otherized and they don't have full memberships in society. And I talk about this all in my book. And let me just say one last thing. One of the big questions as we sort of think about wealth in a new society, I just sent some people this article. And Manuel does a lot of work on environment. The scientists are actually saying that for what's already happened, not what's about to happen, it's likely that the ocean will raise 5 feet. If we don't do anything, they're saying 12 feet. And just think about that, 5 feet. We're not going to be here if the ocean raises 5 feet, I can tell you that. So there's some profound stuff happening in the world. And the reason I'm suggesting that is that as we think about wealth and what the meaning of wealth is, not just for the United States, but because we're in this global society, what does a sustainable model look like that's fair? And it might be something different than the way we think about wealth right now. But we can say, whatever it is, it has to be equitable. And that is, it has to be across all populations. So you can't have one for whites, a different one for blacks, a different one for Latino. But at some point, we may also need to dig deeper and say, what does that model look like? Thank you.